I need you to imagine something for me. Close your eyes if you can. Picture your grandmother, your mother, your father. Now imagine them sitting in their favorite chair in their own home, a cup of tea growing cold beside them. They're expecting the doctor, the nice doctor, the one who always made house calls, who remembered their birthdays, who held their hands and promised everything would be all right. Now imagine that same doctor pulling a syringe from his bag. Imagine him smiling as he slides the needle into their arm. Imagine them trusting him completely in those final seconds. Imagine them never waking up. This is not a horror movie. This is not fiction. This is the true story of how one man, trusted by an entire community, became the most prolific serial killer in modern history. His name was Harold Shipman. They called him Dr. Death. And by the time anyone realized what he was doing, at least 215 people were already in their graves. 215 confirmed. The real number? Possibly 450, maybe more. We will never truly know. If that number doesn't chill you to your core, let me put it another way. Harold Shipman killed more people than Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy combined. He killed more than all of America's most infamous serial killers put together. And he did it while wearing a white coat, carrying a medical bag, and being invited into homes by people who trusted him with their lives. How does a monster hide in plain sight for over 2 decades? How does evil wear the face of compassion? And how did the people who finally caught him find the strength to expose the truth when an entire system wanted them to stay silent? Before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you've ever trusted a doctor with your life or the life of someone you love, share this story right now. Share it because what happened in those quiet English towns could happen anywhere. It could happen to anyone. And the only thing that stops monsters like Harold Shipman is people who refuse to look away. Subscribe to this channel because this story is going to change how you see the world, and you need to see it through to the end. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. I've spent years studying the darkest corners of human behavior, trying to understand how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil. But nothing prepared me for Harold Shipman. Nothing prepared me for the banality of his wickedness, the casual efficiency of his murders, or the devastating simplicity of his methods. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1946, to a working-class neighborhood in Nottingham, England. A baby boy was born to Harold and Vera Shipman. They named him Harold Frederick Shipman. Little Fred, they called him. He was the middle child, sandwiched between an older sister and a younger brother, but from the very beginning, his mother treated him as though he were made of something finer than ordinary flesh. Vera Shipman was a complicated woman. She saw herself as above her neighbors, above her circumstances, above the life that poverty had given her. And she poured every ounce of her ambition into her middle son. Fred was special, she told him. Fred was destined for greatness. Fred would be a doctor someday, would rise above this cramped little house and these cramped little people. Every day after school, young Harold would come home to tea with his mother. Just the two of them. She would quiz him on his studies, praise his intelligence, and remind him that he was better than everyone around him. The other children sensed something different about him, something cold and removed. He had few friends. He didn't seem to want them. His mother was enough. Then, in 1963, when Harold was 17 years old, Vera Shipman was diagnosed with lung cancer. For months, Harold watched his mother die. He watched the disease consume her, watched her grow thin and gray and hollow. But he also watched something else. He watched the doctor come to their home. He watched the doctor fill a syringe with morphine. He watched his mother's face relax as the drug flooded her system, watched the pain melt away, watched her slip into something that looked like peace. Vera Shipman died on June 21st, 1963. Harold was at her bedside, and something fundamental changed in him that day. Whether it was born or merely awakened, something dark took root in his soul. Years later, criminal psychologists would point to this moment as the genesis of everything that followed. They would theorize that Harold Shipman became obsessed with recreating that scene, with playing the role of the doctor, with holding the power of life and death in his hands, with watching that moment of transition over and over again. They would theorize that every elderly woman he killed was, in some twisted way, his mother dying again. But I think it's simpler than that. I think Harold Shipman discovered something in that bedroom in 1963. He discovered that he liked watching people die. And he discovered that medicine would give him the perfect cover to do it again and again. Harold threw himself into his studies with a ferocity that surprised everyone. He got into Leeds Medical School, one of the most competitive programs in England. He married a young woman named Primrose, a quiet girl from a respectable family who seemed completely devoted to him. They had 4 children together. From the outside, Harold Shipman looked like everything a young doctor should be. Hardworking, dedicated, a family man. But the mask was already beginning to slip. In 1974, Harold joined a medical practice in the small town of Todmorden in West Yorkshire. He was the eager young physician making house calls, treating patients, building a reputation as a caring and competent doctor. The patients loved him. The staff loved him. Everything seemed perfect. Then the headaches started. At least that's what Harold told everyone. Terrible, blinding headaches that left him incapacitated. He needed something stronger than aspirin, he said. He needed pethidine, a powerful synthetic opioid. He started prescribing it for himself, forging prescriptions, feeding a growing addiction. But pethidine wasn't cheap, and Harold needed more than his prescriptions could provide. So he started prescribing it for patients who didn't need it, then intercepting the drugs for himself. When the practice discovered discrepancies, Harold was caught. In 1976, he was convicted of forging prescriptions and stealing drugs. He was fined, ordered to attend a rehabilitation clinic, and his medical career should have been over. It should have been over. But the General Medical Council, the body responsible for licensing doctors in the UK, decided to give Harold Shipman a second chance. They let him keep his license. They let him continue practicing medicine. They believed his story about the headaches, believed his promises to reform, believed that this was an isolated incident that wouldn't happen again. 215 people paid for that decision with their lives. In 1977, Harold Shipman moved his family to a new town. A fresh start, he called it. The town was Hyde, a working-class community in Greater Manchester. The kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and trusted their local doctor implicitly. Harold joined a medical practice and immediately began cultivating his image as the ideal physician. He was different from the other doctors, his patients said. He had time for them. He remembered their names, their ailments, their grandchildren's birthdays. He made house calls when other doctors refused. He sat with elderly patients and listened to their stories. He held their hands and looked them in the eye and made them feel seen. The people of Hyde didn't just trust Harold Shipman, they loved him. He was their doctor, their friend, their confidant. And he was already killing them. I've read the files, I've studied the patterns. And what strikes me most about Harold Shipman's crimes is how unremarkable they seemed at the time. An elderly patient dies in their home. It's sad, of course, but it's not suspicious. Old people die, that's what old people do. The doctor is called to certify the death. He fills out the paperwork. He offers condolences to the family, and life goes on. No one questions it. No one sees the pattern. Because Harold Shipman was very, very good at choosing his victims. They were almost always elderly, usually women, usually living alone, usually the kind of people whose deaths wouldn't raise eyebrows. He would visit them at home, often when no one else was present. He would sit with them, chat with them, make them comfortable. And then he would fill a syringe with diamorphine, a medical-grade heroin, and inject them with a massive overdose. Death came quickly, painlessly perhaps, but it came. Then Harold would leave. Sometimes he would call the family himself to deliver the sad news. Sometimes he would wait for someone else to discover the body. Either way, he was always there to comfort the grieving relatives, to sign the death certificate, to assure everyone that their loved one had died peacefully of natural causes. Heart failure, usually. Old age. Nothing that needed further investigation. The families thanked him for his kindness. They said he was a wonderful doctor. They recommended him to their friends, and the body count grew. I want you to understand something about Harold Shipman, something that separates him from other killers. He didn't hide in the shadows. He didn't strike in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. He killed in plain sight, in broad daylight, surrounded by people who trusted him absolutely. He exploited the most sacred relationship in medicine, the bond between doctor and patient, and he perverted it into something monstrous. By the mid-1980s, Harold Shipman was one of the most respected physicians in Hyde. He had a thriving practice, a devoted patient list, and a reputation for excellence. He was active in the community, served on medical committees, and was generally regarded as a pillar of society. Meanwhile, the death rate among his patients was climbing to impossible levels. You see, that's the thing about serial killers. They can't help themselves. They start slowly, carefully, spacing out their crimes. But the urge grows, the hunger grows, and eventually they start to get careless. Harold Shipman killed an average of one person a year during his time in Todmorden. By the time he moved to Hyde, that number started climbing. In some years, he killed more than 20 people. In his final year of freedom, he killed more than 30. But still, no one noticed. No one wanted to notice. Because noticing would mean accepting something unthinkable. It would mean accepting that their beloved doctor, the man they trusted with their lives, was a cold-blooded murderer. There were warning signs. There were always warning signs. Some of the families noticed strange things. Their loved one had seemed fine just hours before dying. The doctor had visited unexpectedly. The will had been changed recently. But when they raised questions, they were dismissed. They were told they were grieving, that they weren't thinking clearly, that they needed to accept their loss and move on. And so they did. What choice did they have? They were ordinary people going up against a respected medical professional, their word against his, their suspicions against his credentials. One woman, though, refused to let it go. Her name was Angela Woodruff, and her mother was Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen was a vibrant 81-year-old, a former mayor of Hyde, active in her community, sharp as a tack. She had no serious health problems. She had decades of life left in her. On June 24, 1998, Kathleen Grundy died suddenly at her home. Harold Shipman was the last person to see her alive. 2 weeks later, Angela Woodruff received a letter from a law firm she had never heard of. Inside was a copy of her mother's will, a crudely typed document that left her entire estate, worth over £300,000, to Harold Shipman. Angela Woodruff was a solicitor herself, a lawyer. She knew what a proper will looked like, and this wasn't it. The typing was crude, the language was wrong, and there was no way her mother would have left everything to her doctor without telling anyone. Something was very, very wrong. Angela went to the police, and that decision, that single act of courage and clarity, would bring Harold Shipman's decades of killing to an end. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles had seen a lot in his years on the Greater Manchester Police Force. Domestic violence, drug trafficking, gang murders. But nothing in his career prepared him for what Angela Woodruff was describing. When she first came to him with her suspicions, he was skeptical. A doctor killing his patients? A respected physician murdering elderly women for money? It sounded like something from a crime novel, not from the quiet streets of Hyde. But Angela Woodruff was persuasive. She was intelligent, articulate, and absolutely certain that something was wrong. Postles agreed to look into it. What he found chilled him to the bone. The forged will was the first piece of evidence. Forensic analysis of the typewriter used to create the document traced it directly to Harold Shipman's office. The signatures were clearly forged, clumsy attempts to replicate Kathleen Grundy's handwriting. It was sloppy work, careless work, the kind of mistake that suggested arrogance rather than desperation. But the will wasn't enough. Postles needed more. He needed proof that Harold Shipman had actually killed Kathleen Grundy. And the only way to get that proof was to exhume her body. On August 1st, 1998, Kathleen Grundy was dug up from her grave in Hyde Cemetery. A post-mortem examination was conducted, and the results were devastating. Kathleen Grundy had died from a massive overdose of diamorphine. The drug was still present in her tissue, in concentrations high enough to kill a healthy adult several times over. There was no medical reason for her to have received this drug. No prescription, no justification. Just a lethal injection administered by someone with medical knowledge and access to controlled substances. Harold Shipman was arrested on September 7th, 1998. He was charged with the murder of Kathleen Grundy, the forgery of her will, and obtaining property by deception. But Postles knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. If Shipman had killed Kathleen Grundy for money, how many others had he killed? How many families were grieving loved ones who hadn't died of natural causes at all? The investigation expanded. Detectives began reviewing the deaths of all patients who had died under Harold Shipman's care over the past decade. They pulled medical records, interviewed families, and identified patterns that should have been caught years earlier. What they found was staggering. Patient after patient had died suddenly, unexpectedly, often just hours after Harold Shipman visited their homes. The death certificates were filled out by Shipman himself, usually citing heart failure or old age. Many of the victims were cremated, making it impossible to test for drugs. But enough had been buried, and when the bodies were exhumed, they all told the same story: diamorphine, massive overdoses, murder. As the investigation continued, then the scope of Harold Shipman's crimes became clearer, and it was far worse than anyone had imagined. 15 victims became 20. 20 became 50. 50 became 100. And still, the numbers kept climbing. I remember reading about this case when it first broke. I remember the disbelief in the news reports, the shock in the voices of the anchors. How could this happen? How could no one notice? How could one man kill so many people without anyone stopping him? The answer, I've come to understand, is more disturbing than the crimes themselves. Harold Shipman succeeded because we wanted him to. We wanted to believe in the good doctor. We wanted to trust that the medical profession was filled with heroes, not monsters. We wanted to believe that someone with an education and a title couldn't possibly be capable of such evil. And that belief, that desperate need to see the best in people, created the perfect cover for a killer. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored the warning signs? Have you ever looked the other way because the truth was too terrible to consider? Leave me a comment below. Tell me about a time when your instincts told you something was wrong, but you talked yourself out of believing it. Because I think that's the most terrifying part of this story. We all have the capacity to be fooled. We all have the capacity to trust the wrong person. And the only thing that protects us is our willingness to listen to that voice inside that says something isn't right. By December 1998, the investigation had identified 137 suspected victims. 137 families whose loved ones had been taken from them by the man they trusted most. 137 death certificates signed by a murderer. Harold Shipman was charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The prosecution chose these 15 cases because they had the strongest evidence, the clearest proof, the most devastating testimonies. But everyone involved knew that the true number was much, much higher. The trial began on October 5th, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. It would last for more than 5 months, making it one of the longest and most complex murder trials in British history. I've read the transcripts. I've studied the evidence presented. And what struck me most was the mundane horror of it all. There were no dramatic confessions, no explosive revelations, just a steady, relentless accumulation of facts that painted a picture of systematic murder. The prosecution, led by Richard Henriquez, laid out the case methodically. Each victim was presented individually, their lives and deaths examined in painful detail. There was Kathleen Grundy, the former mayor, killed for her money. Marie Quinn, 79 years old, who died on the day she was supposed to collect her new glasses. Winifred Meller, 73, who died just hours after telling a friend she was feeling better than she had in years. Joan Melia, 73, who was planning a trip to see her grandchildren when Shipman visited her for a routine checkup. The pattern was always the same: a home visit, a few minutes alone with the patient, a syringe filled with diamorphine, and then silence. Harold Shipman sat through it all with a look of barely concealed contempt. He showed no remorse, no emotion, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. When families broke down sobbing in the gallery, he looked bored. When expert witnesses described the effects of diamorphine overdose, he stared at the ceiling. When his victims' photographs were displayed for the jury, he doodled in his notebook. The defense, led by Nicola Davies, had an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Davies argued that the deaths could have been natural, that the morphine levels could be explained by other factors, that Shipman was being scapegoated for deaths that weren't really murders at all. But even the defense couldn't explain away the forged will. Couldn't explain why Harold Shipman had typed that document on his own typewriter, signed Kathleen Grundy's name in his own hand, and named himself as the sole beneficiary. That single piece of evidence, more than any other, sealed his fate. On January 31st, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all 15 counts of murder. Guilty on the forgery charge. Justice Thane Forbes addressed Harold Shipman before passing sentence. "I've memorized his words because they capture something essential about this case. You have been convicted of 15 terrible crimes," Forbes said. "The sheer wickedness of what you did is beyond comprehension. You took the lives of 15 innocent women, abusing the trust that each of them and their families placed in you. I have no doubt that the families of your victims feel that the sentences I am about to pass cannot truly reflect the enormity of your crimes." They are right. No sentence can properly express the depths of the depravity to which you have sunk. Harold Shipman was sentenced to 15 life terms to be served consecutively. He would never be released. He would die in prison. But for the families of his victims, the verdict brought little comfort. 15 convictions didn't account for the 122 other suspicious deaths. It didn't explain how he had gotten away with it for so long. It didn't bring their mothers and grandmothers back. And it didn't answer the question that haunted everyone who followed this case. Why? Why had Harold Shipman killed all these people? What possible motive could explain such carnage? The answer, I believe, is both simpler and more terrifying than we want to admit. Harold Shipman killed because he enjoyed it. He killed because it made him feel powerful. He killed because he could. And that's the hardest thing to accept. We want our monsters to have reasons. We want their crimes to make some twisted kind of sense, but sometimes evil is just evil. Sometimes there is no explanation that satisfies. Sometimes a man becomes a doctor just so he can decide who lives and who dies. The conviction of Harold Shipman should have been the end of the story. A monster caught, justice served, case closed. But for the people who had been touched by his crimes, the questions were just beginning. How many people had he really killed? How had he escaped detection for so long? Who else was responsible for letting this happen? The British government launched an official inquiry in 2001, led by Dame Janet Smith, a high court judge with a reputation for thoroughness and integrity. Her task was monumental. Review every death connected to Harold Shipman's practice and determine once and for all the true extent of his crimes. The inquiry lasted 3 years and produced 6 reports, totaling more than 2,000 pages. What Dame Janet found was devastating. Harold Shipman had killed at least 215 patients, possibly as many as 260. The actual number would never be known because so many victims had been cremated. their bodies destroyed, their evidence lost forever. But the number of deaths was only part of the horror. What the inquiry revealed about the systems that should have protected these people was almost as damaging. The General Medical Council had known about Shipman's previous conviction for forging prescriptions. They had let him continue practicing anyway. They had trusted him to reform. They had valued his career over the safety of his patients. The coroner system had failed completely. Death certificates were rubber-stamped without investigation. Cremation forms were signed without scrutiny. The very safeguards designed to catch suspicious deaths had been rendered meaningless by complacency and bureaucracy. Even after concerns were raised, the system protected the doctor, not the patients. In 1998, just months before Shipman was finally caught, a local cab driver named John Shaw had approached police with his suspicions. Shaw had driven many of Shipman's patients to their appointments and had noticed that an unusual number of them died shortly afterward. He reported his concerns. He was dismissed. A coroner named Dr. Linda Reynolds had noticed an unusually high death rate among Shipman's patients in 1998. She raised the alarm with local health officials. An investigation was launched, but it was bungled from the start, marked by poor communication, inadequate resources, and a fundamental unwillingness to believe that a respected doctor could be a killer. The investigation was closed. Shipman was cleared. And in the months that followed, while the authorities patted themselves on the back for their thoroughness, Harold Shipman killed 3 more people. Dame Janet Smith's inquiry didn't just expose Harold Shipman's crimes. It exposed an entire system that had enabled them, a system that trusted doctors implicitly, a system that treated death as routine rather than requiring investigation, a system that silenced the very people who tried to speak up. The inquiry made more than 200 recommendations for reform: changes to death certification procedures, oversight of controlled drug prescriptions, new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths, a complete overhaul of the way the General Medical Council disciplined doctors. Many of these reforms were implemented. The death certificate system was changed. Monitoring of controlled substances was improved. The medical profession was forced to confront the reality that trust alone was not enough to protect patients. But reform came too late for the 215 people whose names are listed in Dame Janet's final report. Too late for their families, who had to live with the knowledge that the system had failed them. Too late to undo the damage that one man's evil had caused. I think about those families often. I think about what it must be like to discover that your mother's death wasn't natural, that the doctor who held her hand and told you she passed peacefully had actually murdered her, that the grief you felt was based on a lie. Some of the families found some measure of peace in the inquiry's findings. They finally had answers. They finally knew the truth. But others were left with nothing but anger and emptiness. Their loved ones were still gone. No report could bring them back. In every darkness, there are people who carry light. And the story of Harold Shipman, for all its horror, is also a story of ordinary people who refused to look away when everyone else told them nothing was wrong. Angela Woodruff was the first, a daughter who loved her mother enough to question the unquestionable. When she received that forged will, she could have dismissed it. She could have told herself it was a mistake. a misunderstanding, something that would sort itself out. Instead, she went to the police. She demanded answers. She pushed until someone listened. Without Angela Woodruff, Harold Shipman might never have been caught. He might still be killing today. But Angela wasn't alone. Throughout Shipman's decades of killing, there were people who saw something wrong. People who spoke up. People who were ignored or dismissed or told they were imagining things. And while they weren't able to stop him in time, their voices were crucial in bringing him to justice. John Shaw, the cab driver, noticed patterns that professionals missed. He trusted his instincts. He went to the police. He wasn't believed, but he tried. Dr. Linda Reynolds, the coroner, raised the alarm about death rates. She pushed for an investigation. The investigation failed. But she was right all along. The families of victims who asked uncomfortable questions, who demanded to know why their loved ones had died so suddenly, who refused to accept explanations that didn't make sense, they were right too. And then there were the investigators, Detective Superintendent Bernard Possells, who took Angela Woodruff seriously when others might have dismissed her. The forensic team that analyzed the typewriter, the signatures, the tissue samples, the prosecutors who spent years building a case that would hold up in court. Justice is never the work of one person. It takes a community of people committed to truth, even when truth is painful. Even when truth upends everything we thought we knew. Dame Janet Smith, in her final report, paid tribute to these people. This inquiry has been made possible by the courage of those who came forward, she wrote. The families who demanded answers, the professionals who raised concerns, the investigators who refused to give up, they are the true heroes of this story. I agree with Dame Janet, but I would add one more group to that list. The victims themselves, Kathleen Grundy, Joan Melia, Winifred Meller, Marie Quinn, and 200 others whose names are inscribed in the official record. They were mothers and grandmothers, wives and friends. They had lived full lives, raised families, contributed to their communities. They deserved to die peacefully surrounded by loved ones at the end of long and happy lives. Instead, they were murdered. But their deaths, in the end, changed everything. Their deaths exposed a killer. Their deaths transformed a broken system. Their deaths protected future generations from suffering the same fate. That's not much comfort to the people who loved them. I know that. But it's something. It means their lives mattered beyond measure. It means their deaths were not entirely in vain. Harold Shipman never confessed. He never apologized. He never showed a single moment of remorse for the lives he had taken or the families he had destroyed. In prison, he maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen. He complained about his accommodations. He demanded better treatment. He wrote letters to his wife, Primrose, who remained devoted to him until the end, insisting that he had been framed by a conspiracy of jealous colleagues and incompetent police. The mask never slipped. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Harold Shipman refused to acknowledge what he had done. Some psychologists theorize that he had convinced himself of his own innocence, that his delusions were so complete that he genuinely believed he was a victim rather than a perpetrator. I don't think so. I think Harold Shipman knew exactly what he had done. I think he was proud of it. I think his refusal to confess was one final act of control, one final way of denying his victims and their families the closure they desperately needed. On January 13th, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman hanged himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He used bed sheets tied to the bars of his window. He left no note. The timing was significant. By dying before his 60th birthday, Shipman ensured that his wife, Primrose, would receive his pension. One final manipulation, one final scheme. Even in death, Harold Shipman was thinking only of himself. The reaction to his suicide was complicated. Some saw it as justice, a fitting end for a monster who had escaped the death penalty only because Britain had abolished capital punishment decades earlier. Others saw it as cowardice, a final escape from accountability. Still others felt cheated, robbed of the answers that only Shipman could have provided. Why had he killed all those people? What had he been thinking? Did he feel anything at all for his victims? We would never know. Harold Shipman took his secrets to the grave. But his death, in a strange way, brought a kind of closure. The families of his victims no longer had to imagine him sitting in a comfortable prison cell, eating 3 meals a day, living a life that their loved ones had been denied. The monster was finally irrevocably gone, and his legacy of death gave way to a legacy of reform. The changes recommended by Dame Janet's inquiry transformed British medicine. Death certification became more rigorous. Controlled substances were more carefully monitored. The General Medical Council overhauled its procedures for disciplining dangerous doctors. Harold Shipman's crimes had exposed a broken system. His death created the space for a better one. I began this story with a question. How does a monster hide in plain sight for over 2 decades? The answer I've come to understand is that monsters hide because we let them, because we trust without verifying, because we accept authority without question, because we would rather believe in the goodness of institutions than confront the possibility that they might be protecting predators. Harold Shipman succeeded because the systems designed to catch people like him were built on trust rather than accountability. He succeeded because patients and families who raised concerns were dismissed as grief-stricken or paranoid. He succeeded because no one wanted to believe that a doctor could be a killer. But here's what I want you to remember. Harold Shipman was caught. He was caught because one woman refused to accept a lie. He was caught because investigators took her seriously. He was caught because ordinary people, doing their jobs with integrity, followed the evidence wherever it led. And after he was caught, the world changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but significantly. The reforms implemented in the wake of the Shipman inquiry have saved lives. How many, we'll never know. But somewhere in Britain right now, there's an elderly person whose suspicious death will be investigated rather than ignored. There's a doctor whose prescription patterns are being monitored. There's a family whose questions will be heard rather than dismissed. That's the victory, not the conviction, not the imprisonment, not even the suicide. The victory is that Harold Shipman's crimes forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust and power and the fragility of the systems that protect us. The victory is that his victims did not die in vain. I think about Angela Woodruff often. I think about the courage it took to go to the police, to accuse a respected doctor of killing her mother. I think about how easy it would have been to let it go, to accept the will, to move on with her life. she didn't let it go. And because she didn't, justice was served. Not perfect justice. Harold Shipman never confessed, never apologized, never gave the families the closure they deserved. But justice nonetheless. The truth was told, the killer was stopped, the system was reformed. That's what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. Not certainty, but the willingness to act even when success isn't guaranteed. If there's a lesson in the story of Harold Shipman, it's this. Speak up. Ask questions. Trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, don't let anyone talk you out of believing it. Because the only thing that stops monsters is people who refuse to look away. The families of Harold Shipman's victims have spent decades fighting for recognition, for reform, for the simple acknowledgement that their loved ones mattered. They have turned their grief into activism, their anger into advocacy. They have ensured that the names of the dead are remembered, that their stories are told, that their deaths serve a purpose beyond the pleasure of their killer. That's what victory looks like in the face of tragedy, not the undoing of what was done, but the transformation of suffering into meaning, the insistence that evil will not have the final word. Harold Shipman thought he was God. He thought he had the power to decide who lived and who died, and that no one would ever hold him accountable. He was wrong. The families proved him wrong. The investigators proved him wrong. Angela Woodruff proved him wrong. And every day in hospitals and clinics and homes across Britain, the systems that were reformed because of his crimes prove him wrong again. Every life saved by better oversight is a rebuke to Harold Shipman's arrogance. Every question asked by a patient or family member is a rejection of the blind trust that allowed him to kill. The victims of Harold Shipman cannot be brought back. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story, the irreducible horror that no reform can undo. 215 people, at minimum, lost their lives to a man they trusted completely, but their deaths changed the world. Their deaths protected others. Their deaths ensured that the next Harold Shipman will be caught sooner, stopped faster, given fewer opportunities to destroy. That is their legacy. That is their victory, and that is where this story ends. Not with a monster, but with the ordinary heroes who stopped him. Not with death, but with the lives that were saved because of their courage. Not with despair, but with the hope that comes from knowing that even the worst evil can be overcome by people who refuse to look away. Remember their names. Remember their courage. And if you ever find yourself in a position to speak up, to ask questions, to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, remember the story of Harold Shipman and the people who brought him down. Be like Angela Woodruff. Be like John Shaw. Be like Bernard Posels and Janet Smith and all the unnamed investigators who spent years building a case against a monster. Be the person who speaks when everyone else is silent. Because that's how monsters are defeated. One voice at a time. One question at a time. One act of courage at a time. And that, in the end, is the most important victory of all. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about trust and power and the courage it takes to speak up, share it. Share it with everyone you know. Because these stories matter. These lessons matter. And the only way we prevent the next Harold Shipman is by remembering what happened and refusing to let it happen again. Subscribe to this channel There are more stories to tell, more monsters to expose, more heroes to celebrate, and together we can ensure that the truth is never silent again.